Hi, Hannes. Thank you for speaking to us today. I know that we're absolutely thrilled to have secured three of the clear light infrared saunas as part of the Byron Bathhouse outfit. And I really wanted to talk to you about a range of subjects today, but really starting at the beginning to understand the difference between red light therapy and infrared sauna technology. And then can we talk about the benefits of when you combine those two?
Amazing. Thanks for having me, Emily. I look forward to diving deep into everything health and wellness, saunas, red light therapy. There's a gazillion things to talk about for sure. So to jump straight in, I think, what you essentially have to understand is that an infrared sauna, as the word sort of describes, is a sauna. Sauna always is linked to a room. Could be a square meter, it could be 10, 15, 20 square meters. And it has to do something with heat. So, the overall intent of a sauna, that's the same for an infrared sauna or a traditional sauna, is to raise your core temperature and to make you sweat. And then, all the benefits from that really stem from the fact that your core temperature has increased. And unlike a traditional sauna, an infrared sauna uses infrared light. Infrared light is mostly invisible, but it's, and that's why it's really hard to understand that, because you're not really actively seeing the heat, because it is heat, but it's also light. But this light, and you feel it, you perceive it as heat when you put your hand on one of these infrared heaters, for instance, that is being absorbed by our skin. And over time, we raise our core temperature and we sweat. And so that's an infrared sauna. Red light therapy, as there's a name of the product of the type of therapy says, uses red light. And actually it should be called red light and near infrared therapy because it utilizes two different light spectrums. It uses red light at a very, very specific distinct wavelength of 600 to 660 nanometers. So that's the physical unit of the light spectrum itself. And near infrared of 800 to 860 nanometers. So you're literally using two very specific narrow light frequencies, and it's a type of light therapy. So the primary mechanism for the health benefits is light and not heat. And what happens when these two specific wavelengths sort of hit our skin is our photoreceptors in the skin are being activated. And the overall effect is called photobiomodulation. So it's an activation of light in our cells. And the positive benefits are essentially increased mitochondrial activity. For those that don't know, the mitochondria essentially are our powerhouses in our body, in our cells. Almost every cell, we have gazillions of mitochondria in our body. And if we want good energy, we need healthy mitochondria. And mitochondria can be activated through a range of different things, sleep, cold exposure, heat exposure, but also light exposure. And this type of red light therapy is, as I said, uses these two specific wavelengths. It's been shown to increase the mitochondria, which in turn gives your body more energy. And there's a gazillion health benefits from that. Hormone health, more ATP in the human body, reduced inflammation, more collagen production, testosterone production in men. And it's not just it's not a couple of hundred studies that have confirmed that, but it's more than 8,000 studies that have confirmed the benefits of that, which is why in the US, for instance, red light therapy is considered an FDA Class 2 product. So that's the Food and Drug Administration. It's a governmental body that essentially regulates how severe or how positive a product is, or if there's, any sort of consumer dangers of using that product, the FDA would warn about it. Sort of the equivalent in Australia would be the TGA. As far as I know, the TGA is not really on red light therapy yet, but I would imagine that sort of probably a manufacturer takes this on board over the next 5 to 10 years. This costs a lot of money to get the TGA certification. But to conclude, an infrared sauna uses light, but the overall driver of the benefits is heat. Red light therapy uses two very, very specific wavelengths, in a nanometer range. And the overall benefit is that this light is being absorbed by our body and gives our mitochondria more energy.
Great. Thank you for clearing that up. And I know that at the Byron Bay Bathhouse, there's going to be red light therapy in the change room. And then we've got your beautiful saunas, which have the red light in the technology of the sauna.
Yes.
So is that red light that we're having in the change room provided by you guys as well?
Yes.
It is. Okay.
Yes.
So if I'm in the change room for 5 minutes, is that a benefit?
Yes. So it's always beneficial to use it, irrelevant of the time. Even if you use it for a minute, the light still is being absorbed by your body and sort of, does its magic to the mitochondria. It's the same as, if you sort of, being outside for 5 minutes in the sun or sort of a daylight is better than not being outside. And it's kind of the same logic for red light therapy. The ideal time that you do want to use it, though, is probably 10 minutes at a distance of sort of 20 to 30 centimeters away. So if if you sort of do want to maximize on these 10 minutes, take your time and change your clothes around. That's probably the best setup. But you could also do 5 minutes at the time of changing, and then maybe 5 minutes after the session, and you would still have your 10 minutes. They would probably say that 10 minutes per day is sort of plenty. You can do longer, and there's no, it's not like in the sunlight that you get a sunburn or anything. There's no such thing. It's completely safe. It's non-invasive. There's no UV light part of that. But there's also no benefit to it. Which is, I think, why ideally you sort of want to stick to those 5 to 10 minutes. If you have a greater distance than, say, 30, 40, 50 centimeters, you just increase the session time adequately, right? So let's say, you're not 30 centimeters away, but 60 centimeters, then the ideal session time wouldn't be 10 minutes, but it would be 20 minutes. But any type of light on your skin is beneficial for you, and the ideal session time would be 10 minutes.
Is that because after 10 minutes the cells are saturated? Or
Yeah, exactly. So there's an energy equivalent with a really good red light therapy that sort of is the overarching formula. And it really it really is important that it's a high quality red light therapy device, because there's the range of them on the market. What you really want to make sure is that obviously these devices have the right frequencies, which is what I mentioned earlier, and then B, there's a really high energy output. And if that's the case, we know that approximately 6 joule per minute of energy are sort of being absorbed through our skin, and the maximum that we can absorb is around 60 joules. And so, that's why sort of after 10 minutes it's saturated, But obviously, if you think about it, you stand in front of the light, you could turn around and do your back of that. It's the same as tanning, right? So if you have, if you have sun on your arm, on your left arm, your right arm wouldn't tan to the same degree, which is sort of why if you, for instance, think about vitamin D, you really want to have a full body exposure. And it's the same logic for red light therapy.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And so then we know about those two therapies independently. When you put them together, is there some kind of compounding effect as to the infrared sauna near, mid, and far being more effective because the cells are saturated now with red light?
No, there's sort of an additional compounding effect. However, it comes down to being able to stack different therapies, right? So I think we're all short on time oftentimes, right? We'll get kids at home, we sort of want to do work, but then want to do a cold shower. I did want to fast today, and bloody hell, I did want to do my 10,000 steps. And by the way, I did want to do vitamin D, right? So it seems to be we sort of naturally seem to be short on time anyway. So that's sort of our logic is really that if we are able to stack these different health therapies together, there is tremendous benefit in sort of the time-saving component, right? And if you think about the Byron bathhouse, if someone sort of loses track of time and they really haven't maxed out the red light therapy in the changing room, at the end of the session, they might not have 10 minutes to use the red light therapy. But if you've actually done it during the sauna session, you have actually utilized it. So it really is a time-saving piece. There used to be some sort of theories around the fact that red light therapy in a sauna would be less effective due to the increased temperature. That has so far proven not correct. But again, there's also no compounding benefit to it. So it's really more like a time-saving and efficiency piece where you sort of obviously you relax, you downregulate your nervous system, you detoxify through the infrared sauna. And by the way, great, you're working on your mitochondria through red light therapy.
Yeah, nice. Okay, I wanted to ask you, where do you find the research on infrared saunas and red light therapy?
I think that was spot on, Emily, because unfortunately there is no one central registry that sort of really mentions and lists all the research. It's sort of included. Some of that is in PubMed, others is sort of on Google Scholar, but unfortunately it's sort of all over the place, right? So I think you just really have to go deep in order to find that. Red light therapy is probably easier, just because there are literally more studies available. As I said, there are sort of 8,000, 9,000 studies on this topic. Obviously, various different nature of these studies. Some are sort of just on women in their 50s on one particular treatment. So I think, there's hardly any studies that sort of really just looked at red light therapy versus infrared saunas. Infrared saunas studies are less available. A lot of the research has been done on traditional saunas just because it's been around for, centuries, but maybe, yeah, I mean, for a long time. But infrared saunas are fortunately catching up. So especially over the last 6, 7, 8 years, there's been a lot more studies coming out. Unfortunately, most of them are sort of very well hidden, so you just really have to sort of know where to look. There's, for instance, one from Dr. Ashley Mason that was published at the end of 2021 on depression and hypothermia using a clear light sauna. There's been studies on weight loss and sort of testing them clinically for weight loss. There have been studies on Alzheimer's that are currently being conducted at the moment. But a lot of them, unfortunately, are sort of at the very early stage. I think it's just that universities are sort of catching up to that. Australia is actually one of the leading countries when it comes to really infrared sauna research, especially in Brisbane. From Dr. Joy Hussain, who sort of wrote a PhD on this piece, or another really prominent researcher who's also a big fan of the Byron Health Lodge is Dr. Mark Cohen, who's sort of done a lot of research on contrast therapy and is very fond of infrared saunas. But we have to admit that the research is predominantly on traditional saunas. But I think if we understand the mechanisms of how heat is being delivered to the body, meaning either hot air in a traditional sauna or infrared heat in an infrared sauna, we understand that we have very similar effects, but it's just delivered differently. But obviously, oftentimes we do take causation as correlation or the other way around. Scientifically, that's not always true, which is, I think, why the next 5 to 10 years should be really interesting in the infrared sauna space, because there is a lot of really promising research. We have to understand that essentially infrared saunas have only been around for probably 30 years compared to traditional saunas that have been around for more than 100 years. So that just really shows the gravity of the research to be done. But give it another 5 or 10 years and, infrared saunas probably would have not caught up on that, but there'll be a ton more research coming up.
Okay. Yeah, I did interview Mark, and he did mention that there wasn't a lot of money behind the research for infrared sauna technology. Yep. One of the things that people often, if they have any resistance to using an infrared sauna, it tends to be because they're electrical. And so there's this kind of stigma about the idea of sitting in a box that plugs into the wall, like it's a microwave, or, like that somehow in the future we're going to look back on this like so many other things and just regret that was ever came into fashion as, as a healthful practice to take. But yeah. I'm guessing that you're betting against those odds, and you're really comfortable with the safety and the efficacy of it.
Look, I fully agree with Mark, and I fully agree with some of the skeptics in the industry. To me, it's not an either traditional or an infrared sauna. To me, it's sort of how can you combine those two? And I agree with sort of some of the sort of skeptics in the sense that, if you have a wood-fired sauna, it's fantastic. I mean, you just look into the fire and sort of you connect it to Mother Nature, but what we have to understand is that the fire gives off far infrared too, and the infrared and middle infrared. So, a fire gives off infrared and the heat that we perceive from that is infrared too. So, infrared is nothing that is artificial. It's the sun, consists of 51% or 49% or so is made of near infrared. If we sit in front of a fire, we have infrared. We as humans emit infrared, right? So if you take your two hands and you hold them, if you rub them and you hold them, you sort of feel the heat that we give off as humans. And we understand now that the frequency that this happens with is 9.4 microns, which is exactly what we built in our infrared saunas. But the problem with a lot of the infrared saunas is that some of them, especially the cheap ones, especially if an infrared sauna company has not done their due diligence, is that you have these really high exposures of EMF and ELF. So EMF stands for electromagnetic frequencies, ELF stands for extremely low frequencies. So you essentially, whenever there's an electrical current, you do have a very high exposure of electromagnetic fields. and do have a very high exposure of electrical fields. You know that, but that's the same for a traditional sauna if you use a non-wood fired stove, right? Because not everything's wood fired these days. A lot of them actually are electrical heaters too. So even in those, you do have high amounts of EMF. Now, if we know that that's the case, and by the way, like where you are sitting, where I am sitting, we have EMF and ELF because we're sitting at a computer, because you have electricity in your house. I have electricity in my house. So naturally, we are exposed to these frequencies. Now, the question is, what can we do about it? And we can do a lot of things about it, but it takes engineering, it takes innovation, it takes rigorous testing to figure out how you can actually cancel out this EMF and the ELF. And I think that's essentially how Clearlight, which has been around for 26 years in the US, have really sort of pioneered and become an innovator in low EMF technology. Whilst you sort of look at an infrared sauna, and they all look sort of fairly similar, there's a whole lot of things in an infrared sauna that, that's not visible to the eye. Meaning, for instance, the power unit is sort of based in the roof, and the entire roof on the inside is shielded with certain metal foils on the inside to mitigate the exposure of EMF and ELF into the room where the person is sitting. Or we, for instance, used a carbonized mesh on all of our heaters to actually reduce the electrical fields on that by up to 5 times to the closest competitor. Or some of you might know that from school. If you have an electrical current from minus to plus, and you sort of have the opposite on the backside, these two electromagnetic fields, they cancel each other out. So we utilize that concept in our sauna, and there's a patent on that. So, whilst I agree with you there, Emily, I think those skeptics probably really haven't actually been able to test a really high quality infrared sauna where all these issues have been taken off the table. And if these high exposures of EMF and ELF are not an issue anymore, then yes, you are creating these frequencies artificially, but that doesn't mean that they're not natural. It's the exact same frequencies that we as humans emit. It's the exact same frequencies that the sun emits without the harmful UVB light. It's the exact same frequencies that a fire emits too. And you just utilize Mother Nature, but you create it differently.
I see. Yeah, I know that you guys are one of the only companies that bulks your unit so that it doesn't emit any frequencies, or that they're completely minimal. And can you walk us through a little bit of the technology? Because I actually was alongside somebody that put one of your saunas together the other day, and they seem quite simple, beautiful, and easy to put together at home, which is a wonderful design. But what is that technology that's creating that frequency?
Yeah, and I think that's really where another sort of core innovation really stems from, because obviously, infrared heaters are used in a variety of different cases, from car manufacturing where they sort of dry off glues or paint, to keeping infants or sort of newborn babies warm in hospitals. That's the range of infrared technology that you have. And whilst it is amazing, it makes it really difficult too, because it's not regulated. The TGA doesn't really have this on the radar, neither in terms of health claims, nor in terms of health and safety of some of the materials or heaters that essentially are being used in these type of saunas. Oftentimes you sort of go to the market and you wonder, well, $3,000 for a sauna, how does it even work? And that's exactly the right question. It only works if you make lots of compromises and shortcuts in terms of quality, right? And so that means glues, EMF, some of the stuff we talked about, it can actually backfire for your health. Now, and to answer your question, the heart, or the sort of the key component of an infrared sauna obviously is the heater, right? That's what everything evolves to. Sure, you can build a beautiful cabinet, there are different designs, but how do you generate the infrared heat that then raises the core temperature, which then makes you feel good and you start sweating? In our case, we use a combination of 2 different technologies that we've both invented and that are both patented. So we use a carbon heater, so it's literally carbon as a material. We add ceramic powder or ceramic components to that, and then we put electricity in. And that's literally what we do in lay terms. And what that does is this material mix increases in temperature, and at some point the surface temperature of this heater emits infrared. And this infrared wavelength, or this infrared light, although it's invisible, is exactly what you feel. And it's exactly the type of feeling that, when you rub your two hands together and you sort of hold it on your face, it's that warmth. Where another feeling that people probably know is like if you lie on the beach in Byron or somewhere else in the world and you sort of have the sun on your belly and you're like, oh man, this is so beautiful and warm. But the longer you stay in there, at some point you'll start to sweat because it actually is hot. So that's the feeling that an infrared sauna really gives you. And it comes down to how well you tune this therapy to be in tune with your being the human frequency or with Mother Nature too. And so this carbon ceramic heater is exactly tuned for these 9.4 microns, which is exactly the frequency that we as humans emit and absorb best. And then we combine it with what we call a full spectrum heater. So that's a halogen heater that emits all three types of infrared. We have near, middle, and far infrared. And that really, if we combine these two technologies, we have a really beautifully soothing but intense infrared sauna experience, so that when you use it for 25, 30, 45 minutes, you come out of that and you're like, oh my God, like that was great, but I'm drenched in sweat.
Yes, you are. Okay, on that, and actually just circling back for a moment, we were talking about infrared and red light and combining that if there's any extra benefit or compounded benefit. Do you have any stories, or is there anything that you do when you're in your sauna to improve the benefits?
Yeah, so I think you can do a whole lot of things. The question is really, what is it that you're trying to improve or optimize for, right? So I think one of the first things we oftentimes hear from customers is, oh my God, I'm sleeping like a baby. That's probably the number one story we hear. And the question is, well, why is that? And I firmly believe that it's linked to our nervous system and to the stress that we sort of really face on a day-to-day basis, right? Because we're all overly busy. We all have smartphones. We all have social media. We all have work. We all have, a number of stresses or an information overflow that we're faced with on a day-to-day basis. And obviously that does something to us gradually over time. Like the number one killer at the moment, pretty much globally, is cardiovascular diseases. Whether that's linked to a lack of exercise, movement, whether that's linked to stress, I don't know. It's probably a mix of all these different things together. But, what we do know is that high stress can cause blood pressure, chronic blood pressure can cause, cardiovascular disease. And we see that in the numbers. I think it's 60% globally that contributes to cardiovascular disease. So knowing this, I think sleep and sort of calming down of a nervous system, to me at least, should be the number one priority. Because if you sleep well, that's probably half the rent paid essentially for the next day in order to perform well. For me, certainly, if I haven't slept well, or I sort of maybe only slept 3 or 4 hours a night, I'm not at my best. I don't have the same resilience, and I just, I'm exhausted, literally. So with that, with knowing that in an infrared sauna, I think that should really be the number one thing you do. So leave your phone out, do a meditation, do some breathwork exercises, some very gentle one. Don't do hyperventilation. Don't do Wim Hof breathing, but do sort of maybe a 4-7-8 or do a box breathing. So 4-4-4-4, just to really, turn off our mind and just to really sort of get back into your body. If you wanted to, however, have a really intense sauna session and you sort of really wanted to get a hypothermia response, meaning an artificial fever. So obviously fever is a great mechanism to upregulate the immune system, whenever we are faced with, becoming sick, or we have sort of a virus infection, typically our body reacts with fever. So it essentially mobilizes our armada or, our immune system, raises the core temperature, the entire system gets active, we produce more blood cells, and it's a great, just a genetically built-in feature of us humans, but we don't even have to do anything about it. It just happens. And an infrared sauna provides the same effect to you because it really raises your core temperature by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What that means in terms of fever, it's 38.5, 38.6 degrees Celsius. If you had that in the morning when you wanted to go to work and you'd measure 38.5, you'd stay at home because you well know that your body is going through something. And whilst you relax in the infrared sauna, your body creates that fever. White blood cells are being produced, human growth hormone is actually increased, your body starts to sweat, which means you detoxify, so it really is sort of a one-trick pony in the sense that it gives you all these different amazing benefits. But it comes down to what you want to do. If we haven't even talked about exercise. If you've really had like an intense workout or you just came back from a surf and you're really sore, great, hop in the sauna, sort of make sure your muscles are supported with more oxygen, more blood flow. And it's very well studied that saunas help reduce inflammation in the body and it helps with recovery. But that's just a few of the use cases, right? So it really comes down to what issue you're having. And probably 90% of the sauna, 90% of the cases, sauna can help you to some extent.
Yeah. And actually, just going back to the sleep point, this is a pretty common question. Is it okay to sauna right before you plan on going to sleep? Or is there something about that stimulation process right before bed that makes it hard?
That's one of the most interesting questions that sort of some of the chronobiologists and sauna researchers are looking at the moment. And, at this point in time, there's not a clear study on this. Greg Potter on our podcast, he has a PhD in chronobiology, amazing person. So they're all about times and sort of rhythms of our human body. And we know that we as human beings are at peak performance around 4 or 5 p.m., which is typically when most of the world records, for instance, are being achieved, right? So the world records are not actually achieved at 7 a.m. because you're not at your peak performance. If you have a really intense sauna session, that would be the ideal time to do it because your body is at peak performance, which means whatever stress you put in the body, heat, cold, exercise, workouts, our body is best equipped to deal with that stress. Now, after 6 or 7 p.m., which naturally is when our melatonin cycle spikes, and melatonin essentially is a sleep hormone, but it has a ton more benefits to that. It sort of upregulates the immune system. It's linked to bone health and a variety of different things. We actually do want to slow down because we are preparing, our whole body is preparing to sleep. So if you then did an intense sauna session, say 20 minutes before bedtime, you're sort of putting too much stress on the body. And whilst it doesn't necessarily reduce melatonin, it does provide stress to the body. Now, the question is, what's the greater evil? If you are at 10 p.m., if you're really stressed because you're still working on your phone and on your computer, and you're having a hard time falling asleep as a consequence of that, is that something you want to do? Or is the sauna actually a great way to help you de-stress and downregulate the nervous system? Who knows? There's no research that really has looked at that. However, what we do know, and we've done that internally through a research project, is the closer you sauna to bedtime, the less intense the sauna should be. Meaning, if you normally do 45 minutes in an infrared sauna, or 30 minutes, if you do it just before bedtime, stick to 50 minutes. It's exactly that reason. You want less stress on the body, but you do want to downregulate your nervous system. You want to sort of wind down, and the heat helps you. It makes you sort of feel a bit tired and a bit relaxed, and you because you can't have your phone in the sauna anyway, you're like, oh, finally no work email or no social media or whatnot. Read a book, do meditate, and after that you go to bed straight away. But that's the best way to not mess around your sleep cycles, to not mess around with sort of your internal temperature clock, because obviously if you put high heat or excessive cold just before bedtime, your temperature regulation is sort of confused too. It's like, oh my God, why? I'm supposed to sleep now and everything's sort of supposed to cool down. But then I'll go in a 60 degrees or 70 degrees sauna. Like, that doesn't make sense. But there's no research on this. So this is purely based on connecting the dots from chronobiology and us doing internal research on understanding sleep scores, recovery scores close to bedtime.
No biologists including female data, or is that just the sex bias in science or whatever? The fact that it's all conducted on middle-aged white men. Because a woman, specifically a mother, there's no way she's telling you her best hour is between 4 and 5
I agree.
p.m.
And I think
it's laughable.
I know. I spoke with Greg about that too, and he just said we just don't have the same foundation in terms of research to really look at that. So the answer to that, Emily, is that we don't know for sure. Like at the moment, everything or most, let's say 90% of the research and everything we've just talked about has predominantly been tested on men. Fortunately, I think certainly over the last 4, 5, 6 years, there's more and more research on women coming out. So for instance, the sauna study that I mentioned earlier with Dr. Ashley Mason on sort of using a clear light sauna to reduce depression symptoms in middle-aged women. That's sort of a really pioneering study because it was finally conducted on women. at a very specific
Mm.
age bracket. And it had
Mm.
amazing results, I think, where 70 or 80% of the women sort of reported less symptoms around depression. But that's exactly the problem, and I feel like that's really the problem with social media altogether too, is we report these new studies or these new findings and we think men and women are the same. They're not. And I feel like there's some hints to that, for instance, that men and women should sauna differently. They should sauna ice bath differently. I mean, obviously there's a whole menstrual cycle, there's a menopause, but it's just different. And we cannot compare the same. But to my knowledge, there's not a study out yet that has really looked at this in detail. So there's more and more studies coming out about, men using the sauna, women using the sauna, men using an ice bath, women using a sauna. But there's no conclusion on how women and men should do things differently. So I think it will happen in the next 5 years. And our research, we sort of did look at differences in men and women. And I think there was a tendency that I think women enjoyed less intense saunas as a sort of first correlation. But that would not be scientifically valid enough to make bold claims about it. So the future will tell. But unfortunately, it's a sex bias in research that you've just mentioned. It's so prominent that hopefully that's changing in the next 5 to 10 years.
That would be great.
Yeah, I agree.
So if someone is specifically looking at using an infrared sauna for weight loss or detox or conception or fatigue, is there advice that you give that's different, irrespective of if they're a man or a woman?
Yes and no. It's an underlying mechanism in an infrared sauna, but same in a traditional sauna. You need an increase in core temperature. That's what everything evolves to. That's what everything evolves around. So with that increase in core temperature, your HGH increase, your white blood cells are being increased, your core temperature is increased, your heart rate goes up. As a consequence, your body starts to sweat because the body is literally cooling the body. With that sweat, you're essentially detoxifying through our largest organ, the skin. So that's the fundamental and underlying mechanism for everything. Now, the question is, what's the goal that you're achieving? If you are tackling weight loss, then obviously you really want to burn as many calories as possible during an infrared sauna session or a sauna session altogether. For a long time, people used to think, well, you're only sweating water. That can't be. It's absolutely wrong. And, a lot of these were proven incorrectly because there have been studies on testing infrared saunas for weight loss. And the body fat percentage, I think in the study that we conducted in New York, the US, was 4 or 5% over the course of 3 months. When someone used an infrared sauna 3 times a week, the weight loss was more severe in the evening versus in the morning. It was only a 1 or 2%, but obviously in the scheme of things, that is quite a substantial difference. But we have to be honest here. Is it really the infrared sauna that drove the weight loss? Or is it potentially the fact that if you use a sauna before bedtime, you sleep better, meaning you are less on your phone, meaning you eat less in the morning or throughout the day, you eat less junk food because you have less blue light exposure? These studies don't look at that. They just look at, well, have you used it? Yes, you have. Okay, great. Here's the weight loss. So we have to really be careful, I think, around the fact of saying, yes, an infrared sauna is always going to help you with weight loss, because I believe that's fundamentally not true. But an infrared sauna can help you to change your lifestyle, to say, great, I feel good. I've drank enough water. I've slept well. So the next morning, I will walk to work and I will not take my car, or I will go for a beach walk for 10 minutes. And it sort of triggers all these really positive biases, effects that are really hard to quantify in any study.
Yeah.
But as a tendency for weight loss, for instance, the more intense the sauna, meaning, the higher the core temperature goes, the faster your heart beats. As a correlation, the more calories we burn. It's not just water that we sweat, because obviously our body needs to heat, needs to deal with that heat. And, for the heart to beat faster, we need more energy, and through that we burn calories. Now, but if someone wants to work on detoxification, it would be a slightly different protocol, although kind of similar, because obviously the more you sweat, the more you detoxify through the skin. So there's a tendency again to do longer sessions for good. But obviously if you are unwell and you sort of, you feel like, oh, geez, in a day, sort of, I feel like, oh, something's creeping up on me. you don't want to do a 45-minute session because your body is already sending you a signal to say, like I'm sort of under attack a little bit. I probably just need to sleep well. But what you could do is you could do a shorter sauna session, maybe for 20 minutes, to actually sort of raise the core temperature slightly to really, bring that or to activate that immune system, but not overdo it in the sense that it takes the body too much energy. Because at that point, you might actually make it worse as opposed to making it better.
Yeah.
When it comes to sleep, and then I'll shut up. When it comes to sleep, we talked about that earlier. You don't really want to have extensive and hot sauna sessions before bedtime because it causes stress. It sort of messes around with the internal body temperature clock that we sort of have built in. So you want to take a more gentle sauna session to actually make sure that you're sort of not intruding in our sort of bio clock that sort of deals with each of those things. So the answer is yes, but no, because ultimately everything evolves around the increase in core temperature, and it's your question of how intense you want to do it. But only you, and it's even changes without the season. It changes throughout the day how much and how long you want to use the sauna.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of users at the Byron Bay Bathhouse that are compromised with their health because they are clients that come through the Health Lodge in Byron Bay. And the Health Lodge sees a lot of complex cases and a lot of people that haven't received the help that they've needed so far anywhere else. And when you're talking about detox, those people have a reasonable to a heavy toxic load.
Yeah.
But then it's such a beautiful mechanism. The inbuilt design of sweating out all of those toxins that are stored in our fat. So, yeah, knowing how far to go in and when to come out and when to repeat is something that I know at the Byron Bay Bathhouse, they want to work really closely with all of the clients that come through the bathhouse to make sure that the protocols are individually assigned to whatever that one person's health goals are, taking into account, where they're at with their health right now. It makes
so much sense because, I'm a big believer of exercise for mental health and for detoxification, for maintaining muscle mass, for just feeling good altogether. But if someone is chronically fatigued, has a very high toxin load, is in pain, there's no way you'll be able to lift weights in the gym or do a spinning class for 60 minutes or go for a surf for an hour and a half. It's so far away from the own capabilities of where these people are at in the journey. And that's, to me, the true power of a sauna, an infrared sauna, an ice bath is you can do this and it's going to immediately get better. And is it the holy grail? No, but it's almost like a portal, and it allows you to dive deeper into the health journey, so that hopefully by the end of that protocol that you come out, you're able to walk 2,000 steps without being in pain. Like, that's a major achievement for someone that is chronically in pain. And I think that's the true power of some of these wellness therapies, red light therapy, infrared saunas, ice baths, because you can even do it if you're in pain or if you can't exercise. And Absolutely. It mimics the same effects from a cardiovascular perspective.
Yeah, it's really passive, but it's a really big workout. Like, it's a really big 100%. Challenge physiologically.
Yeah. 100%.
And I did interview Professor Mark Cohen just the other day, and he was talking about, we were trying to ascertain, are there any barriers for anybody with contrast bathing? And it's the same for infrared saunas, It's actually just the mental capacity to want to move through a challenging place and be comfortably uncomfortable. And, you think about being in an infrared sauna, and everybody is going to tap out at a different time because they've reached the comfortably uncomfortable. They've taken a couple of breaths and then they've gone, I really need to get out now.
Yeah.
And out they go.
Yeah. And after that, you're proud. You're like, yes, I've done it. I know this was tough, but I've mastered it. I've done something good for me. And I think it sort of just cascades into a lot of other beautiful, positive developments altogether.
And so can you tell me, how did you end up getting into the infrared light business?
I've always had a passion for health and wellness. And I, obviously in hindsight, it's always easier to tell these stories as opposed to when you're in that moment. But my grandma always used to say that she used to make cakes but I wasn't interested in cakes. I'd rather want to go down to the greenhouse and sort of get a fresh cucumber salad and make and tomatoes and make myself a salad. I was 14 at that time. So I think, and now you could say, well, you're just a salad person. But I don't think that's true. I think naturally I sort of always understood that if I put good food in my body, I have more energy and I feel better. And I like a piece of cake nowadays too. So it's not that I'm against cake by all means, but that was a really beautiful reflection. And I sort of then played American football semi-professionally, and I sort of realized that again, like if I actually look after my mental health and my physical health, I perform better on the field. I was a quarterback, so I was kind of pulling the strings, and I sort of had the team behind me and really enjoyed it. But I realized quite quickly that I really need to become the best version of myself in order to be the best person or the best player on the field. And so that's been quite at a young age. But then I lived in New Zealand and my background is engineering. So I sort of moved into, as Germans do, there's this whole joke about it. Germans are engineers. So moved into engineering, but then met my business partner, who was my working colleague at the time. And he had been on the Longevity Now conferences, which is a very well-known alternative health conference in LA. It's where sort of Dr. McCullough used to hang out, or David Wolf, or Deepak Chopra, sort of some of these, I probably call them a bit older, sort of health pioneers from 10 or 20 years ago. And we got to know Clearlight. Clearlight was a very small company back in the days, but it was the first company that had done anything about the EMF and ELF in an infrared sauna, because up to that day, that was the main reason people didn't want to use, or the experts didn't want to use an infrared sauna, because of high EMF exposures. But Clearlight was the one that pioneered it, they patented it. And we were like, oh my God, like this great product. Just from an engineering perspective, I'm like, oh, wavelength, electricity, EMF, ELF, red light. Oh God, that's fantastic, So I really enjoyed it from an engineering perspective. But then obviously we used it, we tested it, we measured all the EMF and ELF. And we're like, oh my God, we need to bring this to other markets. And that's sort of when we started off in New Zealand and Australia. And then I decided to move back to Europe at some point. And I spent a fair bit of time in both the Australasia as well as Europe. And it's just come such a long way. It's so beautiful to nowadays see how popular infrared saunas have become, and, how trendy it is at the moment. But obviously, the one thing that is really tricky is the exposure around EMF and ELF. There's a lot of companies on the market that haven't done their homework. And what I really enjoy, the fact that it is a trend, and that people understand about it. Yeah, there's a lot of due diligence, or a lot of shortcuts are being made for the sake of, cheaper products. And that's obviously a slightly worrying thing. But overall, I'm incredibly grateful for the popularity that contrast therapy, infrared saunas, red light therapies have gained over the last 12 years.
Yeah. And it must be nice to know that your company sits at the top of that pack. I mean, you guys are clear leaders in the space and you've done your due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, I think, whenever there's something we can do better, we're not shy away from doing it, and I think that's the only reason why I have confidence in saying we are the lowest EMF and ELF sauna on the market. I've measured more than 50 different brands wherever I go on the world. I always have an EMF meter with me. I've never measured a lower EMF and ELF exposure in infrared sauna. And then obviously it comes with a lifetime warranty. You're able to integrate red light therapy, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite a strong value proposition. And that's why I'm happy to literally say it's the best that there is. Like, otherwise we would have done it. If there was a better way, we would have come up with it by now. Doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case, but for the time being, I have a lot of confidence in the design and the efficiency of the product.
And I wanted to ask you, because this comes up a bit as well, can you just take an infrared sauna and put it outside?
Yes, you can. 90% of the infrared saunas are made for indoors. It's just, it's easier to manufacture, obviously, with water ingress and whatnot. But then also B, if you look at some of the colder parts of the country, so New Zealand and Southern Australia, when the temperature drops below 5 degrees Celsius, there's an issue with the fact that an infrared sauna is not designed to heat the air as quickly as possible. That's fundamentally what we have to understand. An infrared sauna is supposed to run between, say, 45 and 60 degrees Celsius. That's the ideal temperature range. Everything above that, you're sort of more in the traditional sauna space, which is all about hot air. And obviously, if you put an infrared sauna outside that has not been built for the outdoors, means it's not insulated well, It doesn't have thicker walls. It doesn't use thermal glass or whatnot. You have heat losses, right? So the infrared sauna doesn't even get to these temperatures. So now in Byron, or that area where it's sort of warm throughout the year, it's not so much of an issue. You can just put an indoor sauna outside. You need to shelter it, or you need to sort of have a weatherproof cover around it to protect it from the rain. Not a problem at all. But in colder regions of Australia and New Zealand, you need a dedicated outdoor infrared sauna, which we have designed too. But it's sort of a bigger, beefier, unit that has more power and more electricity altogether to deal with the reduced air temperature.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually think I just made the assumption because the wood isn't treated to keep the toxins out, that it would be risk to, I don't know, taking on mold or,
No,
absolutely not being waterproof.
I mean, it isn't waterproof, and that's, not necessarily the wood, but it's really the electrical components in the roof, for instance. But, the infrared sauna, because you don't splash water on there, it's actually pretty much mold free. And obviously, if you use it, say, for a couple of hours per day, there's a lot of heat inside that completely dries off any human sweat inside the sauna. Obviously, in a commercial location, if there's a high sort of turnaround rate of people sort of using it, there are more constraints for the unit, but they've been designed for commercial use too. So mold is not an issue.
What are we going to be cleaning our saunas, our beautiful clear light saunas down with at the Byron Bay Bathhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because the fact, well, so most infrared saunas, at least in a commercial location, really run at 60, 65, maybe even 70 degrees Celsius in a commercial setting. So that really makes sure that whatever bacteria and viruses you have in there, they don't survive these temperature ranges, right? So they denaturate, I think, from a DNA perspective. Obviously, you do want to clean it, right? Because there's a lot of sweat and toxins that are being sort of, expelled through the sweat. And you would just take a cloth and sort of a biological disinfectant. That could be anything, a mixture of essential oils and water. Or you could sort of use as I said, a biological disinfectant and just wipe down the benches, potentially wipe down the floor, wipe down the door handle. The glass just needs a sort of a glass cleaner wipe to make sure that it looks good. Obviously, if sort of people walk from the outside into the sauna, you might just need to vacuum clean it once a week or once every 2 weeks, to get the dust essentially out. But that's all you need to clean. They're fairly self-sufficient and, don't need a lot of cleaning other than wiping it down.
Yeah, great. They kind of have their own inbuilt cleaning mechanism.
Due to the heat, yes.
I know the staff will be cleaning the ones at the bathhouse regularly, but that's good to know for private use.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have one here and maybe clean it once a month because I just leave it on for another 10 minutes after my session, and that makes sure that whatever sweat or viruses and bacteria sort of have been in there, they just die off due to the temperature. And, as I said, any water, any moisture, any sweat just dries off.
That's a great pro tip.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you finish your infrared sauna, you just leave the machine on for 10 minutes.
Yes.
And it's going to kill any residue that's left behind from you.
If the temperature is above 63 degrees Celsius, right? So it just takes a bit of time to get to the temperature. But even if you don't hit that temperature, it's going to dry off any sort of water or sweat inside. And then you could just wipe it down. But oftentimes you sit on a towel anyway, and you just take the towel out, right? So with that, most of the sweat on the benches is sort of taken out already, and you just put the towel into the laundry.
Okay, great. I would like to end with a couple of short, real pro tips, if I can pinch
Sure.
you for a moment longer.
If I really want to have an intense infrared sauna session, I would either take a hot shower beforehand to already increase the core temperature ever so slightly, or I would do a workout beforehand. So that might be a run, or it could be a weight class, or anything that just raises your core temperature and raises your heart rate. And you will notice that if you jump into the sauna after that, it's going to take a lot less time for you to break the sweat because of the elevated temperature and heart rate already. And with that, if you stick to the same time, it's going to be an even more intense infrared sauna session. The second one you could do, and I think that's a pro tip too, is you need to increase your water intake. You need to be hydrated well, because obviously your body can only lose water and you can only sweat if you have water inside the system. If you don't have water and you're probably dehydrated, your body is like, no, I'm not going to sweat here for you. And with that, you're sort of going to limit yourself to the detoxification pathways of the skin, because we need the sweat to carry out some of the toxins. So if you know that you're hopping in an infrared sauna, start drinking probably 2 hours ahead of time. So, maybe finish half a liter to a liter of water. And you really need to make sure that after the sauna session, you stay hydrated well too. So at least have another half a liter of water. You probably are thirsty anyway, so it's going to come natural to you. Put on a pinch of high quality salt or any other electrolytes to make sure that you obviously also look after the minerals, because you're not just sweating out the bad stuff, you're also losing salt and minerals in that process. Pro tip number 3 is to do some breath work inside the sauna. Again, under no circumstances do any type of hyperventilation. Do not do any type of Wim Hof breathing or anything. You might lose consciousness and it could be dangerous. However, what you can do is you can do breath work that down regulates the nervous system. The easiest way is the box breathing, 4-4-4. So you do 4 seconds inhale, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds exhale, 4 seconds hold, and you just do that a couple of sessions. You'll instantly notice that you'll get calmer. You will have less desire to sort of do anything on your phone, and you sort of come out really nice and refreshed. So, we call our clear light, we call the high-end sauna that we have the sanctuary range. Really treat it as your sanctuary. Make sure you take the time to de-stress and to really prioritize yourself. Pro tip number 4, if you feel like a kick, and I would not do that if I go to bed, do a cold shower or do an ice bath. It's going to feel great if you do it, but again, don't do that before bedtime, because you're essentially messing around with your natural sleep cycle. Tip number 5, which is more an ice bath tip. If you have an ice bath, or if you use an ice bath and you use red light therapy, first do the ice bath for maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes, then do red light therapy for 5 or 10 minutes, because it's been shown that a reduced skin surface temp increases the effectiveness of the photobiomodulation. Doesn't mean that an elevated skin temperature reduces the effectiveness. It'll still be effective, but the colder the skin temperature, the quicker you get the benefits. And that's going to be your ultimate mitochondria supercharger in terms of energy. So it's a great protocol, for instance, in the morning, an hour to 2 hours after waking up, just to give your body some time to actually wake up and to sort of, to not mess around with cortisol or any other hormones effects.
And how long before or after you have a sauna session can you eat?
Great one. Pro tip number 6, do not eat any food 2 hours prior to an infrared sauna. Obviously you want to make sure that whatever digestive fire you have going on inside your body is not being interrupted by stress through a sauna. If you need a snack, maybe a banana or an apple, just something that sort of gives you a bit of an energy rush or an energy push quite quickly. After the sauna, you can pretty much eat straight away. Most people will not feel very hungry, and the reason for that is that an infrared sauna sort of gives you an immediate blood glucose spike. Right, so you sort of, this energy being actually released to the body, and therefore you're feeling less hungry. But most people feel hungry an hour after that, because obviously at that time is sort of, the blood sugar comes down, and you're like, oh my God, I'm hungry now, So therefore, I think that's a great tip.
Yeah, that's another reason why it's probably going to be problematic to eat dinner and then try and sauna before bed.
Ideally, I think you're just eating at 6 or 7, and then you can use the sauna at 9, and then you go to bed at 10. That's at least how I do it. But then I do a shorter sauna session at night time.
Right. Okay. Thank you for your time. And thank you for having such a beautiful product available for us. Thank you for including your products at the Byron Bathhouse.
Amazing. Thanks for having me today, Emily.